Mud creates a number of concerns for those involved with the salvage effort. First among them is personal safety, because mud is slick and slippery underfoot. Make sure you're wearing sturdy boots with skid-resistant soles if possible. And wherever you go, go slowly. In addition to a long-sleeve shirt, long pants, and a hard hat, add the following gear: rubber gloves or possibly even leather gloves, depending on the situation. An apron to protect you and your clothing from contaminants. A dust mask. Safety glasses to protect against splashes. And sturdy shoes or boots. Mud can vary in composition depending on your region of the country. In coastal areas, it's likely to include salt and sand. Elsewhere, clay and silt, which when dry becomes hard like cement. Mud that contains salt can quickly corrode objects. If it contains iron, it can stain.
You have to think about what could be in that mud. Where did this mud come from? Mud could have sewage in it. In that case, you have to really protect yourself with personal protective equipment such as masks and gloves and aprons, because you don't want to be breathing these type of things in.
Mud containing sewage or other contaminants is a hazard, but mud can also conceal sharp objects like broken pieces of glass, metal, or wood. That's another reason for wearing sturdy boots and gloves and bringing along probing tools.
To dig objects out of the mud, it's often good to have a tool like spatulas and tweezers that you can use to manipulate around in there and kind of make sure that you're not getting yourself into a dangerous situation.
How you salvage muddy objects depends on whether the mud is wet or dry. Wet mud is the priority. Objects with mud already dried on them are stable and can be dealt with later. If the mud is wet, you should rinse objects before the mud hardens. Otherwise, wet mud will trap moisture on the object and encourage mold.
You would decide to rinse an object if you were sure that the object was stable enough to handle being rinsed. Some objects are more fragile than others. You want to just get rid of as much of the mud as you can as quickly as possible. So the main thing you'll need is water, whether it be tap water or distilled water in bottles or spring water. Some objects, if they're metal objects or maybe wooden objects, if you have bins that you can set up to actually immerse the objects and progressively cleaner water, like 3 or 4 bins, and keep changing the water out. Your last bath, make sure the water in the bin is relatively clean.
Cleaning muddy paper or photographs requires patience and care.
If you're considering rinsing off a paper object or maybe a photograph, and it's a single layer, just like one photograph, not a stack of photographs stuck together or in an album, you'll want to make sure you give that some support. You can put it on a piece of plexiglass and put it at an angle, and then use a hose and spray the front of that object and then turn it over into the reverse side. If you have books that have mud on them, don't open the book up when you go to rinse it. Make sure you hold that book closed really tightly, and you just want to rinse off the cover and just give that a good rinse. You don't want to deal with trying to open that book up and rinsing individual pages, because once again, they're paper, they're very vulnerable.
One thing you should remember: don't try to rinse or wash any fragile or mold-damaged objects. Leave those for a conservator. But if your resources or time is limited, freezing is a reliable temporary measure.
Freezing is an option to keep things in stasis that are wet, especially if you don't have space or time or fresh running water. If you're dealing with a large collection, you're just going to keep things in stasis until you can either have a conservator look at it or you can slowly go through and process some of these items. For a large collection, I would suggest just doing as little triage as you need to do and just get things frozen if you have the space.
Take a look at the water section for more information on freezing and air drying collections. Whether you have air dried your objects or have gotten to them after mud has already dried, you can remove remaining dirt using these techniques. If mud has dried on textiles or paper-based materials, use an air bulb to carefully blow dirt away. Gently remove dried mud off other materials with a clean, natural bristle brush. The key word here is gently. You want to avoid forcing dirt into materials like leather, vellum, cloth, and paper. That can damage them and make treatment more difficult. There's one other method for removing dried mud, using a vacuum with a HEPA filter. This filter traps very fine dirt particles inside the machine and doesn't exhaust them back into the air. But you need to evaluate before you vacuum.
You just want to be careful to completely examine the object and make sure that it's stable enough to be vacuumed, that you're not going to suck something up into the vacuum. And one way you can prevent this from happening is using a screen. If part of the object does become loose, it won't get sucked up into the vacuum, it'll just be on that screen, and you can remove it and have a conservator reattach it and repair it at a later date. You have to just be very gentle as you try to remove any debris from an object. You don't want to rub or scrub an object. You want to use a very soft bristle brush and just gently go over the surface of the object and ease the flaking mud into the nozzle of the vacuum.
In the end, when cleaning muddy objects for drying or freezing, it's important that you work carefully, not hastily. This will greatly improve your chances of salvaging objects that have been damaged by mud. Remember, when in doubt about steps to take, consult a conservator or your field guide to emergency response.